Hello, everybody. I'm Gareth Williams for Faithful+Gould. Hopefully now everybody who's expecting to dial in has dialed in. We'll just look to get started because I'm aware that most of you will be on your lunch times. There's a few instructions on the screen at the moment which will hopefully help highlight any issues if there are any problems. You should all have the ability to type an internal message. So again, any queries throughout the session, if you do have any, type the message in and we'll look to respond to those then at the end. Just seeing whether there's any more people looking to join. Okay, so we'll get going now, as I said. So again, just be aware that we at the sort of highways section of Faithful+Gould are looking to try and do some CPD sessions throughout the next 12 months and continuing on. We're looking to try and host sessions that people are able to attend within our southwest region. We look to vary locations, but also try and provide the ability for people to dial in for these lunch and learn sessions, obviously allowing people who can't access the physical meetings so that we can again try and help out and provide some CPD for those going forward. I'll recap on some of those future events towards the end of the session. So again, just getting going on why we're all here. I'm assuming that we've all got a fair understanding of the NEC. This presentation is not necessarily intended to be an instruction, but more guidelines on the typical issues that we as project managers experience during construction contracts that employ the NEC contract. So I wanted to highlight some of the pitfalls that generally get experienced and ways that we look to try and smooth these out, or certainly try and deal with them through the process of the procurement and the delivery of the contract. So just a bit of an introduction to myself. I'm an engineer. I've practiced with both public and private sector businesses throughout my career, but favoured the construction aspects more than the design in the end, and got a bit of a passion for contract law and seeing works actually being delivered and coming out of the ground. Hence my shift to Faithful+Gould and trying to be involved with some of the projects that we're currently involved with. So NEC programs, what we're looking to cover today, again, some of the issues that normally go wrong. I'll provide an introduction of on the requirements of the program under the contract and the principles of the NEC. We'll be looking at the drafting and some of the issues then through drafting that cause issues with the management of a program, and how we look at programs to assess change. And as I said, there'll be an opportunity to ask any questions at the end of the session. So NEC, the program. Again, I know most people tend to be fixated by compensation events and managing change. That seems to be the hot topic. However, none of that can really be dealt with properly without understanding the program, the intricacies with the program, and really what is fed into it. So as NEC project managers, engineers, contractors, these are the things that normally get experience. You've got a project manager who's too anxious to accept a program. They're not necessarily sure what they're accepting, what liability they may be accepting, what they're reviewing or what they should be reviewing. We've got contractors who are not necessarily fully aware of the full obligations and what they should be considering to sort of feed into their durations. We've got contractors estimators coming up with a program to be competitive at tender, but without fully consulting or considering the delivery team, which then becomes an issue when we get to site. As a result of the first point I made, and well, point 1 and 2 really, we end up with prolonged periods of time without an accepted program, which obviously leads to confusion and uncertainty on where the job is heading, in terms of time and cost, which obviously leaves both parties in a predicament when it comes to reporting. Compensation event quotations that are affecting time more often than not get submitted without an accompanying Clause 62 program, which makes it very difficult to assess. Obviously then getting into discussions over the assessment of a compensation event that has time to be agreed included, and several months down the line the contractor coming back and looking to recover costs associated with this time. We've got timescales within the contract data not necessarily sufficient for the delivery of a project, which puts the contractor under pressure, and generally contract data drafting errors that lead to ambiguity and discussions, as I say, throughout the project. So NEC and the principles of the program. Obviously, NEC is driving away from the traditional forms of contract, such as the ICE or ICC now and JCT, and applying project management principles. With this, the schedule and the program obviously becoming the main thread for successful delivery of an NEC contract, quite often referred to as the heartbeat, which unfortunately the program doesn't necessarily always receive the attention that it's expected to receive through the drafters of the NEC. There's far greater contractual emphasis on the contractor to produce the program and regularly update one. We're now obviously trying to move away from the employer's agent receiving one program and the contractor working to another. So the program, should be consistent and transparent for both parties. Both parties buy into the assessment and progress and acceptance of a program, which helps the health of the project and leaves both contractor and project manager to advise the client team and respective superiors where the project is heading. So today, hopefully, we'll highlight some of the common issues and methods that we try and employ to overcome them. So the contractor's program, what are we expecting to receive from the contractor? Well, essentially, as I said, this program is the contractor's tool, and it's showing their sequence of works. It's showing how they're going to deliver the works, included within the works information by the contract date. So the project manager is responsible for assessing this program to see whether he thinks it's realistic, whether it can be achieved, whether it accounts for everything it needs to account for as required by the contract. As I said, there's a significant buy-in by both people, or both parties required. But referring back to the point I made earlier about project managers being anxious about what they're accepting, I'd like to sort of highlight clause 14.1 of the contract. It's not described here. I'll leave the reading and a review of the contract to yourselves. But 14.1 is really that protection for the project manager, as it's summarised here, really, that if the contractor submits a program or any other communication that's then later found to have some error in it, the project manager is not accepting the liability of that error. That issue remains the liability of the contractor. But as you see from the chart below, this is the normal procedure. The contractor will submit a program. Project managers tend to take the full allocated time span. The period goes by, and obviously there's significant change and progress, and then the project manager sort of withholds his acceptance because he's then in a position where he feels the program that he's accepting doesn't necessarily reflect what is happening out on the ground. So there's no right or wrong. Well, I suppose there is a wrong, but there's a quantity of data that we as project managers should expect from the contractor. We should be in a position where we've got enough information to be able to accept that program and essentially draw the line in the sand, baseline that program, and move on to the next, which then helps us understand how the job is progressing, how any change or risk matters would affect that program and any delivery of it. But as I said, when we've got programs that are in abeyance, either through the contractors failing or the project managers failing, we very quickly lose track of where we're headed. We could be several months down the line without an accepted program, and we're really referring back to an accepted program that doesn't show any resemblance of what is actually happening. This, as I said, doesn't help the contractor or the project manager, so it's in everybody's interest to work together in getting to a position where we can accept a program. Just provide a brief overview on some of the tools that we commonly get exposed to, with depending on the scale of the project. Quite often, contractors are submitting programs or developing programs with the use of Primavera P6 or Asta PowerPoint. Generally, on a smaller scale, projects are quite often developed using Microsoft Project. But what I would say here is that unless we specify it, more often than not, the contractor would look to submit a PDF output of the program, which is useful to a point, but doesn't necessarily allow the project manager to fully scrutinize that program, to assess it, and then subsequently allow him to accept it. So something that I'll probably cover a little bit later on is where possible, requesting raw data and the output file from the software that the contractor is utilizing for his program development, so that, as I said, the project manager is in a position where he can interrogate the program and actually see what's feeding into it and what's developing it, to get a greater understanding of any changes that have been implemented through that period of time. So going back to the requirements of the contract, I'll provide a brief overview of contract data. What we've got here, again, the text I've highlighted in red is really to represent anything that what I see often is where people are acting as project manager or employers employing a particular group to look after the contract administration. When we've got the program, and quite often as engineers, we're drawn to the detail of the program itself, the schedule. But what I would say is, as project managers, we should be referring back to all of the contract documents to understand what aspects would actually feed into and inform any time aspects. Again, anything related to time that I've highlighted in red should be considered within the program. Again, these may be physical aspects of work that the works information is specifying or requesting. There may be site constraints. It may be things that you'd expect to see on a program that highlights the contractor has fully understood his obligation, whether that be a period for a reply or a time scale. He knows that he's got to submit some drawings to the TAA for review in advance of them constructing an aspect of work. Quite often I see documents without starting date or access date or completion dates completed within contract data part 1. Again, I think depending on how the intention of the scheme and the scale of the scheme, it's important to understand the employer's requirements here. I know sometimes we're in a position where as the employer team don't necessarily have a full understanding of how long a project may take, so they may leave it open to the contractor to provide the completion date, for example, and sometimes we're in a state of flux with the development of a project, so it's not understood when the project may start or access. But I'll just clear up a point here that the starting date is different to the access date, in that the starting date is that date that the contractor is allowed to start spending money on the scheme and incurring costs, where the access date is the date that they're physically allowed to access the site. Again, please consider also the revised program intervals. Again, the period as by default is 4 weeks, but please consider the length of the project. Obviously, if we've got an 8-week scheme, you wouldn't leave that period for reply as 4 weeks, because obviously that program wouldn't mean a great deal to you as you were going through the project. Again, other elements that would affect time would be compensation events, whether things like weather are remaining in the contract. We've got optional statements. This is a particular bugbear of mine. I'll just highlight here, if statements. As I said, the common drafting issues. More often than not, we see these contract data elements of a contract issued with if statements left in. The employer or the team drafting the document on behalf of the employer really needs to understand what we're trying to achieve. We've got optional statements in Contract Data Part 1 and 2, and if we choose to leave an optional statement in Contract Data Part 1, it need the relevant cross-referenced optional statement in Contract Data Part 2 needs to be deleted. I'll touch on that in a second, but as you can see here, we've got optional statements for completion of the works. We've also got optional statements for programs. So this is particularly important for today's topic. If the employer wants the contractor to have the opportunity to fully develop a program and following award with a comprehensive review of exactly what they're developing, and not necessarily taking the estimator's program forward, then this statement here would progress into the contract documents, and then the subsequent optional statement in contract data would be deleted. We've obviously then got X clauses and Z clauses. Z clauses being the opportunity for the employer to transfer risk to the contractor. So these are something that the contractor's team should obviously fully consider, and the employer's team should fully consider, because that transfer of risk would arguably attract time to certain durations and certain activities which would need to be considered with the development of the program. Contract Data Part 2, as I say, go back to these optional statements. More often than not, we see contract data documents with this opportunity for the contractor to identify his program, as well as the earlier Contract Data Part 1 optional statement. One or the other should be used, and I can't reiterate that enough. More often than not, as I said, both are left into the contract, which then subsequently procures arguments at a later date, where we've got a contractor's program that was really only considered by an estimating team for the purposes of the tender, doesn't necessarily consider all aspects of the contract delivery that you would expect. Project manager has reviewed it and made X number of comments and suggests it's not acceptable in its current state, and then the contractor returns his comments to suggest, well, by default it is the accepted program because it was entered into Contract Data Part 2. And obviously, the employer's team is then thinking that he had 4 weeks following award to be able to accept the program, and that ambiguity would obviously favour the contractor. This doesn't necessarily provide opportunity to the contractor, but if it's the accepted program and the contractor's program is flawed and perhaps doesn't consider all the risks he's exposed to, then he's also stuck with that. And that baseline is then taken forward for subsequent revised programs, but also is the first program that is used to assess change. Now, the benefits of leaving that optional statement in contract data part 2 are for I would argue schemes of bigger scale with a prolonged procurement period where the employer wants the contractor to really consider the program holistically with everything else. So when he submits his tender costs, the employer can assess the prices along with the program in the mindset that the contractor is aware that that program is going to be the accepted program, and fully identifies and fully shows the employer that he fully understands what is required to deliver that piece of works. I.e., if the costs for tender 1 were the cheapest, but the program looks more achievable and more realistic for the second best bidder, then the employer can obviously make that decision and it's informed. But as I said, generally with local authority highway schemes, the procurement periods are short. This doesn't allow the contractors team, sufficient time to realise the benefits of that that program being identified within contract data part 2. So it's generally recommended that the contractor has the 4 weeks following award. But as I said, these issues are seen quite a lot, and have more recently having to sort of deal with this and having arguments and discussions like I've just described. So again, as I said, looking at what the Z clause, the intention of the Z clause, does the employer realise that some of this transfer is having an effect on time? Really need to help out the employer sometimes when we're looking to transfer risk, to see, does he really understand that by transferring risk to the contractor, he may actually be attracting some other subsequent risks to himself. Okay, program requirements. I'll just cover here now. The requirements are set out in the NEC. So the top bullets here describe some of the reasons that the project manager may have for non-acceptance of the program. As I said, I won't spell out here the requirements are set out in the contract, because I'm assuming that everyone who's dialed into this has got a level of understanding of the NEC, has got access to a copy. But these are the reasons. So we've sort of bulleted these on aspects that are considered to be hard facts, as the top 2 bullets describing really, does the contract show all the information it should show? Does it comply with the works information? Hard facts. But then there's some level of subjectivity when the project manager is then in a position where he's looking at the logic of the program, he's looking at durations. Do they seem realistic? Do they seem practical? What this is really trying to get back to is, has the contractor really applied the correct level of resource to a piece of work that can actually then be achieved in the time scales that he has suggested? Does it consider all the risks that he's exposed to? Can one activity be done straight after another, or does it need to wait for another activity to be completed? Has he got an activity or 2 activities that he's identifying, the same gang delivering the 2? There's elements that, generally cause heated discussion, but these are the things that as project managers we need to assess. Therefore, we need the data off the contractor to support his program, so that we can provide that full assessment. So some of the reasons that the programs fall down, and this unfortunately is something that we experience all too often, is incorrect terminology. It sounds pedantic, but it helps everybody if the program is submitted with the phrases and terms as defined by the contract, i.e. start date, access date, plant completion. The contractor may think his program means something, but it's good to get this kind of thing sorted out early, so that thread can run through the duration of the project. As I mentioned, providing data to help the project manager understand whether something is realistic or not. It may be an activity, some piling. The project manager is looking at the time allocated and thinks there's no way that the contractor can deliver that. If he's able to support his duration with calculations to show that with the level of resource and with the level of output, he can achieve X amount of piles within X amount of days. And that closes out the argument, makes it very quick, makes the process efficient and acceptance very efficient. Again, not accounting for risks. There's all sorts of risks, not necessarily the risks prescribed within the contract, but there's risks that the contractor is exposed to that he needs to account for. So we'll cover risks slightly. As I said, there's a little list here, but as project managers, when we've gone through a review of the contract data, we've gone through a review of the works information, they're the sort of physical, factual things that we were looking for that have been understood within the program. But here are some of the things that the contractor should also be considering. His own risks, weather, for example. The contractor should be understanding the risks that he's exposed to up to a point where it may trigger a compensation event. That's if the contract hasn't actually deleted it. You've got plant breakdowns, you've got quality and availability of labour, risks through different seasons, depending on the nature of the works, ecological risks. There may be issues with access to the site. It might not be off a main road, it could be, in the back of beyond. There's all sorts of risks that would be fed into the contractor's program, or should be, to give the project manager assurance that what the contractor is coming up with is actually realistic and achievable. So, following the initial review and assessment of the contractor's first program for acceptance, the clause 31, this is obviously assuming that contract data part 1 optional statement is used and not contract data part 2. But we're looking at whether the contractor's considered everything he should be considering. Has he fully understood the requirements of the contract? Is it all in there? Has he allowed for sufficient time? I'll give an example here where we've just identified a concrete pour. Contractor is suggesting that he needs 10 days and he's allowed himself 1 day of time risk allowance. Well, obviously, as project managers, we'd be considering the nature of the works, how intricate it was. Is it in the middle of January where he may be exposed to frost risk? So is that 1 day actually sufficient? These are the things that we'd be querying with the contractor, when reviewing and assessing the program. And then we've got the critical path. Is it clear? Does it spell out to the contractor, to the project manager, all of the events or activities that are sensitive and would be prone to change if they were interrupted in any way? And then we've got the float. Obviously, this generally causes discussion between parties, but just to be clear, we've got float as referred to in the contract. Terminal float is the period between planned completion and completion and is solely owned by the contractor. Total float is any float between activities that can be used by both parties to mitigate any delay. For example, if there was 3 days float between one activity and the subsequent activity and the project manager instructed a change, then that 3 days could be utilised to mitigate the effect of that compensation event without affecting the planned completion. Time risk allowance, again, is a contractor-owned value of time. If the time risk allowance that the contractor applies to a duration is not utilised, that will obviously create float for the contractor, resulting in his planned completion coming to the left. Again, I'll stick with 31s for the second. Hopefully you can see this clearly. This example is just something I've drafted just to highlight a typical program submission, depending on the scale of the works and the nature of the contractor involved. I've highlighted, excuse me, just looking for my pointer. duration, because I want you to keep an eye on this. And also this bar here is associated with the terminal float, as I just described. So we've got task ID, task name, we've got a start, and we've got a finish. As I said, this would be a typical submission from contractors working on local authority schemes. As NEC PMs, then we would scrutinise this programme, and following discussion, we get to a point where we're now looking at a programme which is more in line with what the contract wants and is expecting. We've now got a number of columns introduced that cover time risk allowance. We've also got resources, which is something else that will help us out. We now see that there's a logical sequence running through this program, and we can see what gangs are applied. We can now see that, you know, the resources that are applied to each activity are not expected to do the same job. But also with this time risk allowance, you can see now that we've got extended periods of time. I'll try and go back so that we can see some of these. Earthworks, for example, was initially set to be a 5-day operation. Following discussion with the project manager, the contractor has now acknowledged that there's risks that he should have considered previously and has applied some time risk allowance to that operation, which has increased the activity duration by a few days. The net effect of all this is that that terminal float period has been reduced. Planned completion has gone to the right, but this now gives the project manager far more confidence that that is actually a realistic and achievable program. So moving on to Clause 32 programs that are revised through the duration of a project. Here really I want to sort of highlight the importance of record keeping. And as project managers, there's a heavy reliance on the supervisor, and if clerk of works or inspector are applied on the scheme, keeping really good up-to-date records to highlight anything that may have impacted the contractor's delivery of any piece of work. So, as I said, you know, this is just an example. We cover here perhaps how a contractor has recorded progress of an activity compared to the supervisor's take on what actually happened. So plant completion has moved out by a few days on this particular activity, and the contractor has suggested that this was down to unforeseen utilities being discovered. But actually what happened on site was the unforeseen utility was discovered, acknowledged and accepted that in this instance was a compensation event. But also what was noted by the supervisor were delays to the contractor as a result of materials not being delivered and breakdowns with plant. I'll just highlight here who the risk owner is for these particular events. So we then acknowledge that plant completion does shift, but only one of the days is down to a compensation event. So that then would be considered with the valuation of that compensation event. So good practice for the revision of Clause 32 programs. We typically try to sit down with contractors and from day one get an informal discussion going when they or in advance of any formal submission of a program. This allows us to have early visibility of any suggested sequence changes, any early warning matters or risk matters that may well be affecting plant completion, albeit this is the contractor's take at the moment. You know, we've got sight of all this, but as I said, you know, there may be effects of, or the contractor's take on their effect on plant completion as a result of a compensation event that is currently being assessed. So these are all things that need to be considered, and obviously the earlier the project manager has got sight of these things, the earlier that he can have discussions with his supervisor and the whole project team, and the more efficient the process will be when it comes to acceptance of the program. But again, I'll just sort of highlight here really Clause 32.1 of the contract is suggesting again that we're expecting the contractor to fulfill his obligations under this contract and also under common law to look to mitigate delay, and that is any delay under the contract. So that's the employers or the contractors. He's looking to do what he can do to deal with the effects of any change or any risks that have been occurred. Some may or may not be compensation events, but he shouldn't be waiting for the project manager to instruct him on how to proceed. This should be dealt with by the contractor. If he's aware of anything, this should be sat down with the project manager so that we can all make an informed decision going forward. And we just look at good practice in relation to Clause 62 programs. Again, unfortunately, more often than not, compensation events are quoted and dealt with by quoting for the direct works costs, and the contractor waiting towards the end of the job to identify what time impact he feels that the sort of cumulative effect of these compensation events have had, and then try to deal with this assessment after. What should be happening is the Clause 62 program should be submitted with a quotation so the project manager can assess that quote with all of the information he needs based on cost and time, and obviously that time will have an effect on cost. Following awareness of any event, this should be completed with the program, given everything the project manager needs to assess it, baselines from the last accepted program, any risks that have been applied, and as I said, when we're looking at this, we're looking at what the contractor believes the effect to be. It's not necessarily what you're accepting straight away until you've assessed the compensation event through discussion. Then we look at the effect on planned completion. Again, it's quite common to have discussions with contractors where the quotation is priced on the effect on completion date. It's actually what we're assessing is the difference between the date of the planned completion on the last accepted program to the new date of the planned completion. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a second. But again, if we're assessing compensation events, 63.7 of the contract suggests there that the project manager is assessing it based on the assumption that the contractor reacts competently and promptly to the compensation event. Hence, he's not sat back allowing something to take longer than it should. He's doing everything in his power to mitigate the effects on the employer. So how programs are used to assess change. Again, I'll provide an overview. The contract stipulates what should be in the program. It doesn't necessarily limit what also could be included within the program to help the project manager and the employer understand where progress is heading. Early warnings could be included, and I would encourage to be included because it presents the project manager with the view that the contractor has on the effect of that early warning if it is actually realised. Any risk matters, anything that may have an effect on time, it's useful to see the effects of that on the programme. And again, if you accept the programme with these elements on it, you're not accepting the liability for those. So for example, if the contractor is suggesting his plant completion is moved out by 3 weeks based on a number of early warnings and other events that are littered throughout the programme, you're not accepting that change to the plant completion. You're only accepting that you believe it's a realistic representation of what may happen if that actually does progress. It's only when the compensation events that have been or are being assessed, when they are completed and implemented, and any change to plant completion as a result of those will then influence and inform the actual change to plant completion and hence the change to the completion date of the project. Again, this is just summarising what I've said essentially, But again, the contractor should be providing as much information as he can to the project manager to understand whether the completion date or plant completion date needs to be moved as a result of that change. So I'll provide a brief example of a compensation event and how it's implemented. If we look at this top graphic, this is just a simple representation of a contractor's program that has been accepted. It shows a suitable sequence of works, but during or following award, we've now instruct the contractor that he can't access the site for a couple of weeks. We also introduce another compensation event where we've implemented a design change. It's quite clear from this that we can see that there is an extension of time required for the contract. Planned completion is moving out as a result of the change, and that net effect, because of terminal float being maintained, is a few weeks. But we then look at a different example, again referring back to my note earlier about the importance of good record keeping. If we consider these two activities, I know, bear with me, it's very simplistic, but hopefully it captures the point. We've got this bar of activities suggesting the critical path that influences plant completion. This is our terminal float period. These items at the moment are obviously non-critical. As the job progresses, we've introduced a compensation event through the middle of this sequence that was on the critical path. But following assessment of the compensation event and the impact on accepted programs, when we take an account of supervisors' records, clerk of works records, we then actually realise that the doing the event awareness, the contractor's progress on this non-critical activity has actually overshot the critical path. This has now become the critical path. So planned completion has gone beyond the completion date as a result of the contractor's performance. This isn't necessarily inefficiencies. This could be realization of contractor risk that wasn't sufficiently catered for within the durations or sequence of that works. But as a result, following assessment of the compensation event, we acknowledge that there are direct costs attracted to this piece of work, but as a result of the contractor's defined cost increasing as a result of his planned completion going beyond the completion date, that cost is already being incurred by the contractor, so cannot be incurred a second time by the compensation event. So in summary, what I'm saying is, because the contractor has delayed himself and he's already incurring these costs, the extension of time that may well have been allowed as a result of this is no longer entitlement. There is no longer an entitlement of it because the cost is already being realised by the contractor. It's probably worth adding here that if the compensation event was introduced, which extended planned completion and pushed the job on, then it was subsequently realised that the contractor's planned completion was likely to have been delayed anyway. Because of the timing of the instructions, the contractor would cover his own delay aspects by the costs recovered through the compensation event. So again, as I reiterate, the importance of the record keeping and really up-to-date progressing of contractors' programs is critical for full and detailed assessment of compensation events. I'll try and describe a brief example of a compensation event and the contractor's obligations. As I said, we've got 63.7 of the contract suggesting the contractor needs to deal with any delay. We've also got common law. The delay and disruption protocol is a good reference for anybody to review. It's free. You can download the PDF online, but this again just highlights the contractor's obligations in relation to delay and how to mitigate delay. So I'll just cover again. We've got a grid line for a steel frame building. the contract is awarded with works information, site information, and there's no reference to this unforeseen utility within any of the documentation, but it's discovered very early in the contract. The contractor's Clause 31 programme is submitted. As I said, a full review of the works information and site information has no suggestion that there would be any utilities present, but when the contractor scans for services pre-dig to protect his men and fulfill his own health and safety requirements, actually discovers that there's something in the way of the grid line A1 and B1. Get in touch with British Telecom or whoever the stats company may be, who can't get out to site the next day, but come the following day and then advise that there's going to be a number of days for them to divert the services and get it dealt with. So this program is the Clause 62 program that the contractor submits, suggesting that this whole sequence of works is now delayed as a result of the stats diversion. As I say, the contractor is required to mitigate delay where possible. And again, please bear with me, this is a very simple and simplistic example, but he sits down with the project manager in this instance and looks at what he can do to deal with this event and to minimize the impact to the employer. So we just bear that in mind, that this program represents a 6-day extension to the program as a result of the contractor's take. But following an assessment of the works and through collaborative discussion on how the issue can be resolved, the contractor, if you note here, has taken a different approach and has resequenced the works. So he starts at grid line A6 and B6, so basically approaching the works from the other end. This allows him to carry on with works, gives sufficient time for BT to get in and organise the diversion, but acknowledges that there will be some lag to be able to complete the works at A1 and B1. So the net assessment of this programme shows 1 day extension to plant completion, not the 6 as previously suggested, and that would be an acceptable conclusion to that compensation event. Now, hopefully, these examples have provided some sort of thought on how we as project managers should consider and approach the assessment of programs, all the things that we should consider. So again, appreciating that we're eating into people's lunch, sort of move into a concluding slide at the moment. So again, I'll just sort of reiterate and cover what we've discussed, that as we all know, the NEC contract is very administrative heavy, but without the program it's very difficult to assess change and progress. It's very important to get early buy-in by all parties involved to develop a culture and develop a process for dealing with these timely. Please be aware that, as I said, the project manager is not accepting liability of anything that may turn out to be incorrect later down the line. And again, the effect on planned completion is what we should be dealing with for compensation events, not the effect on completion. And the two dates may be different depending on what sequence of works, what progress is being captured at the time. So again, please just be aware that we're looking at suitable detail provided with all programs to be able to actually demonstrate the effects of change. We need the contractor's site team to feed into programs, not just a planner developing a program, so that there's two distinctly different views on what's going on the ground and what's actually being presented to the project manager once a month. The project manager also needs to consider exactly what detail is in the contract to understand what actually should be considered within the program and for time. And as I said, good record keeping is essential. Now, This was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Appreciate there's far more detail that I could go into, but obviously not over a lunch and learn session. So, as I said, I'm Gareth Williams. If you've got any questions later and you'd like to get in touch with myself or Adam Rome from Faithful+Gould, please do so. And as I said, if you've got any questions or queries now in relation to what we've just discussed, please either type in, or I'll now start to unmute to see whether there's any questions. Thanks very much. Is anyone able to, again, I'm not sure whether you actually have got access to the IM. Can someone just test it out just in case there are any questions? Thanks, Brent. Appreciate, again, there's a fair bit of detail to cover and it was a very quick session. So, you know, if there are any queries, I'm more than happy to help where I can at the moment. We've got a question coming through. From Kiran. Yeah, we've recorded this session, so I'll be looking to issue this fairly shortly. So hopefully, again, you'll have an opportunity to digest what we discussed today. And again, if there are any further questions in the future, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Okay, I believe the audience is now unmuted. So if anyone wants to ask a question rather than type it, please go ahead.
Hi Gareth, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi mate. Have you ever, when you've had a situation where you've had to reject a program, so you've requested a resubmission within a period, that resubmission hasn't come, and then inevitably that rolls on to the following month, then the following one. How have you addressed that? Have you ever been in a position where that's happened, and how have you addressed that particular issue?
Are we talking Clause 32 programs, Bryn?
Yeah, Clause 32, yeah.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, more often than not. Basically, there's a number of ways of doing things, and you often get into a situation where you're not necessarily doing things by the contract, unfortunately. But there's sort of capture-all type situations where we try to sort of mop up all of the progress that we've recorded to site and get to a point where we can just draw a line in the sand by sort of forensically reviewing the last accepted program and the progress that the supervisor has recorded. Obviously, the penalty with the program isn't necessarily as it doesn't appear to be as damning as it can be with early warnings and compensation events. But the issue, the penalty to the contractor here is that the project manager is then left responsible for dealing with the program. So he will then obviously assess the program based on what he thinks it should be, and is taking account of all the supervisor's records essentially to portray where he believes plant completion should be. And that acceptance would again, following discussions with the contractor, get you to a point where you can get in an agreeable state. But again, as I said earlier, it doesn't help anybody because you're always in a state of flux, and it makes it very difficult. And some would argue that it can potentially favour the contractors if you end up later down the line just trying to mop everything up and get everything resolved. Does that help, Bryn?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I was just sort of thinking back to where you've got specific recourse in the contract for say a C quote not being submitted. There's a specific recourse, a specific action to be taken. There's not quite the same
No, that as I said, that penalty
It's not often recognised by the contractor that they're sort of doing themselves a disservice by not getting a programme to an agreeable state.
yeah. Well, the penalty there, I suppose, as I said, to the contractor is that he might not be recovering what he thinks he'll be recovering. So if the program is left up to the project manager to assess, he'd be taking account of everything that he's got to his disposal. Will be accounting for contractor's progress as to how he sees it. So any impact of an acknowledged change is more than likely going to be less than the contractor would present it if he was in a position to do so, and if he was up to date. He's obviously got a better opportunity to represent where he thinks he'll be, and that is removed and taken away from him if he doesn't keep up to date.
You think do you mean purely in terms of if it's a contract that comes in with the compensation event clause? Compensation event quote, or
yes,
is that
yeah, because that is the main
well?
that is the main sticking point. Because obviously, the job will still be delivered if a program isn't accepted. A non-accepted program doesn't remove the responsibility by the contractor to progress with the works. So the works will still go on. They'll still be presented. But if the contractor has been subject to change, then he's limiting his own ability to demonstrate the impact of that change if he doesn't keep up to date and present sufficient and suitably detailed programs to the project manager. So he may end up recovering some time or some money, but he may not necessarily be recovering what he believes he's entitled to, because it's going to be assessed on what the project manager thinks it is. So that is really the main recourse and the main risk to the contractor by not suitably keeping abreast with Clause 32 programs.
Great, thanks, Gareth.
All right, we've got a message here typed in. In an instance whereby the latest accepted program was accepted 4 months ago, for example, and we are now assessing a change, you shouldn't just use the latest accepted program without updating for progress, etc. Is that correct? Well, yeah. The contract suggests that the project manager uses the last accepted program for assessment of a compensation event. But does it really help the project manager? So the contract isn't necessarily detailed in this instance, but I would suggest that it's common practice for the project manager to again take account of progress. And to be fair, there's generally useful information with programs that haven't been accepted, because there may be aspects of them that are not acceptable, but there might be a lot of information which actually is acceptable and informs the project manager of how progress is going. So long as that can be corroborated with supervisors' records and the like, and progress is accurately captured, then the project manager takes account of the last accepted program, but again is applying his knowledge of where we are actually where we are at the time of the event, so that he can be fair and reasonable in making an assessment of the compensation event. Because obviously, if the project manager based his assessment of a compensation event on a program that was 4 months old, for example, and didn't take due account of progress as he was well aware of changing, then if this particular matter was escalated to adjudication, I would imagine that the adjudicator would take account of what the project manager was actually assessing when he was arriving at any damages to the contractor in that instance. So I would always take the view that, yes, you're using the last accepted program as a basis, but you would feed into that with progress captured as you have experienced it on site. Hopefully that answers that question. Is there any more questions? I'm so conscious people are probably eager to get back to work on this Friday afternoon. If there's anything else coming through, then feel free. We've got time for one more. But as I said, failing that, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'll be looking to issue the presentation to everybody on the attendance list. I imagine there's others who probably wouldn't mind receiving it and certainly having some dialogue over it at a later date. So, well, again, if there's no further questions, I'll look to wrap things up. So, again, hopefully that wasn't too much detail or was enough to give people a flavour of what we as project managers should be doing when assessing programmes, which will give us far greater understanding for when we move on to assessing change during the construction of the works. So thank you very much all.
Thanks, Gareth.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth.